All right, cool. Welcome, everyone. So I'm joined today by Greg Sheridan, who is a renowned foreign affairs journalist in Australia, as well as a popular author. And the book that we're going to be discussing today is his latest book called Christians. I have a copy here, The Urgent Case for Jesus in Our World. Greg, thanks for joining me today.
Great to be with you, James.
So first question that I wanted to ask about is just sort of what prompted you to write this book, and maybe also you could tell people sort of a bit about what it's about and what is sort of your key motivations here.
Well, James, you're right. I'm basically a foreign affairs journalist. I've been a professional journalist for 43 years. I've been the foreign editor of The Australian for nearly 30 years. This is my 8th book, but it's only my 2nd about Christianity. I guess a few things prompted me to write it. One is that a few years ago, the book before last, I attended a lot of writers' festivals, and I was astonished that there was not a single book at any of the hundreds and hundreds of books promoted at these writers' festivals about Christianity, and nothing in favor of Christianity or Judaism. And I believe both Judaism and Christianity underlie our civilization. So that astonished me a bit. The second thing is, let me not hide in the shadows at all. I'm a believing Christian, and so it's taken me 43 years or so of journalism to work out what the most important story is. But, journalism is a lifelong search for the truth and for good material. And I think I find both of those in Christianity. And then I must say, when so I'm a Christian of Catholic background, and we traditionally didn't spend all that much time in the scriptures. When I spent time first in the Old Testament for the last book and in the New Testament for this book, I found it was so much fun. And I thought, really, people should read this, just leaving the religious dimension of it aside. How can you be in our civilization and never have read the New Testament, never have read the book of Job in the Old Testament, and so on? And I just enjoyed it so much. And then finally, you'll have to forgive this from a believing Christian. As you get older, you realize that your moment when you're going to have a chat to your maker is approaching, and maybe there ought to be something on the positive ledger to balance the sort of 400 billion qubits on the negative ledger.
Yeah, well, that's fair enough. Yeah, so I think that the point you make about the importance of Christianity and the Bible to Western civilization, you talk about that a few times in the book, and you just mentioned before. I think that is important, and that is something that I've commented about, maybe in slightly different ways before, about people needing to understand, cultural heritage, and also understanding viewpoints that they reject or disagree with. I think that that's one of the things that you draw out quite well in the book. So the first half of the book, broadly speaking, is you talking about some of the key figures from the Gospels. I think you talk about Mary and John, and obviously Jesus. Paul as well has a chapter. And then in the second half, you talk about some contemporary Christians from different walks of life.
Yes.
I don't think I've actually read a book that has that format before. What sort of prompted you to do it that way?
Well, my last book, God is Good For You, had a similar format, and
Right.
the publisher, Allen and Unwin, fantastic publishers. I don't know if there's a single person in the publishing house who would agree with my book or what I write or anything, but they're brilliant publishers, and they suggested this structure to me because I had a long series of gestational conversations with them about what I was trying to write and turning the ideas into a coherent book. So you're right, the two halves of the book. The first half of the book is a search for Jesus in the ancient world and in the Gospels and the epistles or the letters of the New Testament themselves. So as you say, there's a chapter about Mary and Paul, one about angels and so on. And there's also two other chapters, one about what I regard as the increasing sense that the Gospels are pretty good history. So I'm not saying history proves the resurrection, nothing like that, but that the incidental parts of the gospel are very reliable. They accurately convey Jewish life at that time. They were written about that time and so on. And then the other big chapter in the first half of the book, I think, is about the crucifixion. So my proposition is that the death of Jesus is the most radical thing in Christianity, not the resurrection. I mean, any religious tradition would believe that God will conquer death. And many religious traditions have had the idea of the gods interacting with humanity, Krishna walking on the earth, typically in a time before time, a prehistoric time. Christianity, I think, is the only religious sensibility that I know of which has had the idea of the all-powerful, omniscient, eternal God becoming man and suffering death and humiliation and torture and defeat on earth. And this is the most shocking and the most radical and the most counterintuitive thing. And of course, when you come to the Gospels fresh, you realize just how weird and radical and strange they are. The other thing I wanted to do was to read them as a journalist. You know, I've got a lot of experience with looking at documents and what's the truth here, who wrote this, all that sort of thing. I'm not suggesting I produce any path-breaking biblical scholarship here, but I think the books are great to read as a journalist looking for sources and narrative and so on. So that's Jesus and his first friends, if you like. And I'm astonished at the vivid humanity of them. You know, Paul is often so irascible and so bad-tempered and so on. It strikes me if these were forged documents later on or fake documents made up to produce an orthodox religious view, you wouldn't have all that cross-grained humanity in them. Then the second half of the book is about Jesus' contemporary friends. So Paul is a magnificent transition figure because Paul was not there when Jesus was conducting his mission on earth. He didn't know Jesus before the crucifixion and the resurrection. So Paul, in a sense, is a modern Christian believer. Without having known Jesus in person, he has this most intense experience of Jesus. And then a number of the people I interview in the second half of the book also have a very intense sense of the personality of Jesus and his role in their lives. And they're interesting people alive today, you know, pastors in the US and the UK, religious leaders in Australia, 3 women who are doing magnificent things because of their Christian convictions. And of course, 2 chapters on Chinese Christianity. Of course, the growth of Christianity in China is one of the most remarkable phenomena of the last 100 years.
Yeah, I think I've found the 2 chapters on Chinese Christianity the most interesting because it's quite hard to get, well, at least from my perspective, quite hard to get kind of accurate information about sort of what goes on there and how different religious groups and how Christians are treated. Yeah, so I quite enjoyed the I guess anecdotes that you had from there. There's also, and one of the people you interviewed is also the Prime Minister, interestingly, which I was a little bit surprised in.
The former Foreign Minister of Singapore, George Yeo.
Yeah.
That's the name you mean, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, no, I mean, our Prime Minister.
Scott
Morrison. That's correct as well. But our Prime Minister, Australia's Prime Minister. Yeah. Sorry,
Prime Minister, yes, Scott Morrison. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yes.
Which is interesting as well. And I didn't know that he was the first, I think, Pentecostal Prime Minister in the West, you said, which I did not know. So that was interesting. Yeah, one of the things that you talk about in the book, well, you sort of mention in the book is that you're trying to take I think you call it a mere Christianity approach. So you talk about people from different denominations, you yourself being Catholic, but you present people from, like, I think Anglican and Pentecostal and so forth. I'd be interested to sort of you don't really say very much about your attitude toward, I guess, denominational pluralism or religious difference within Christianity. For me personally, this is something that I've always found sort of puzzling or difficult. That may partly reflect my background, but yeah, I'm just sort of curious. What are your what would you sort of comment or reflect on about that? You know, as well as all of the strife there has been historically and between different Christian denominations and the issues with that. How should we sort of think about that?
Well, it's a big issue, James. So I'm a bit influenced by 2 writers, C.S. Lewis and, of course, the great G.K. Chesterton. But C.S. Lewis was himself an Anglican, an Orthodox Anglican, but he wrote books about Christianity which appealed to Christians of all denomination and indeed to non-Christians as well. And what he pioneered this term mere Christianity. So he tried to focus on the consensus amongst mainstream Christians. Now, I'm an Irishman, so there's a particular Irish disease. You agree with someone about 99% of everything and then fight to the death in mortal combat on the 1%. Now, when I was a kid, which is a long time ago, the Catholic Protestant friction in Australia was a significant element of our national life. And one reason we had the sort of secular settlement was so that Catholics and Protestants wouldn't spend their whole time fighting with each other. Now, Christianity is very much, in my view, a minority position in the West. Religious belief, I think, is on fire in most parts of the world, and Christianity is a very rapidly expanding religion, but not in the West. So by the West, I define that as Western Europe, North America, Australia, and New Zealand. Christianity is in decline in all those societies, and it's now, I think, in a minority position in Australia. It certainly is in Britain and most of Western Europe. A big minority, but nonetheless a minority. And I think it's very silly of us to focus on the things we disagree about. I don't think the disagreements have become irrelevant or, unimportant, but, Catholics believe that the Eucharist becomes in substance the body of Christ in Mass. Protestants believe it's a symbolic presence of Christ. So you could write a book about, transubstantiation, but where would that get you? And also the level of the lack of knowledge about the basic elements of Christian belief is so great in our society that the society really needs to be introduced to Christian belief. Billy Graham, oddly enough, was a very interdenominational and non-denominational figure. When people went down at a Billy Graham crusade and pledged themselves to Christ, to Jesus for the rest of their lives, he didn't say, "Goodo, come and join my Southern Baptist congregation." He welcomed them, counseled them, and then sent them to the congregation that they came from. So if they were Catholics, he sent them back to Catholics. And if they were Presbyterians, he sent them back to Presbyterians. And he could change your denomination if you wanted to. But, and I think that leads me to my final observation. The real division in Christianity today, I think, within Christianity, not between Christianity and the society, but within Christianity, is between people who believe in the truth of the scriptures and the resurrection of Jesus and eternal life. In other words, the statements embodied in the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed. And then on the other side, there are people who, very wonderful people, I'm not criticizing them personally, who say, well, I come from a Christian tradition, but I don't believe the miracles really happened, or Jesus didn't really rise bodily from the dead, or whatever. And my view of that kind of Christianity is, if it's all a metaphor, I'd rather be at the races. Forget it. I'll go to the beach. I've got better things to do. There are plenty of metaphors in Shakespeare. It's only of interest if it's true. And I think the division now in Christianity is within each denomination between those who think it's really true and those who think it's a metaphor or a myth or a legend or something like that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I have friends and other people that I've talked to from a pretty diverse range of Christian backgrounds. I mean, I suppose, yeah, maybe not that diverse in terms of the world spectrum, but at least a variety of different perspectives. And one of the reasons I say that is because I definitely have spoken to people who call themselves Christians who, from their point of view, they would say that like Christianity is true and the core claims of it are true, but they wouldn't necessarily agree with, say, all of the miracle claims in the New Testament, for example. I think different ones will say different things about the resurrection per se. But I guess, I mean, this is beyond my qualification, especially as an atheist, to adjudicate. I guess what I'm trying to say there is that most Christians that I speak to, well, pretty much all of them, will say that they think Christianity is true, but there'll be differences in terms of what they sort of mean by that. Another sort of reflection on what you said is that I've definitely spoken to some Protestants, or people from a Protestant background, who are, well, some are quite positive towards Catholicism, and there are some who are barely willing to call Catholics Christians, which, I mean, I think that's silly, to be honest, but that's definitely an attitude I encounter. So, yeah, I don't know. At least from my perspective, it's sort of interesting in terms of how people define the in-group and the out-group, I suppose. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, most of those hostilities have disappeared. So this is my second book on Christianity, and both of them have adopted this mere Christianity point of view. And I've found tremendous welcome and fellowship and kindness amongst all the Christian denominations. And, in the last book, in the second half, when I'm interviewing and profiling people, I put the Pentecostals and the Benedictine monks next to each other, because I visited a Pentecostal church in Melbourne, and that had great rock and roll music in the way the modern Pentecostals do. And it had projected on the screen various verses of scripture, which were forming part of its musical presentation. Then a little while later, or a little while before, I visited a new Benedictine monastery in Tasmania. Contemplative monks live an enclosed life, a life devoted to prayer and chanting the Psalms and so on. And they were singing the same verses of the same scripture as the Pentecostals were. Now, they were singing it in a kind of a plain Gregorian chant. The Pentecostals were doing it in rock and roll. But at the end of the day, it's the same scripture, the same verses from the same Bible, the same book of the same Bible. And I thought, really, they have much more in common than they have apart. Both are very experiential, both the Pentecostals and the Benedictine monks. It's not a purely intellectual thing. It's an experience of religious belief. So I have found that the old denominational hostilities have largely disappeared. Catholics and Anglicans nowadays, the Sydney Archbishops, Catholic and Anglican, tend to be best friends with each other. Going back to liberal Christianity, it's not my desire to criticize or demean anybody, not at all. But it seems to me that liberal Christianity, the sort of Shelby Spong Christianity, which says, Christianity is true, but the New Testament is full of lies. I mean, if the miracles didn't happen, that means the New Testament is full of lies. So if it's lying to me about the miracles, why am I interested in what it has to say about anything? So I have a chapter on angels in this book, partly for this reason, because angels are all through the Bible. They're right there at the beginning of the Bible. They're all through the New Testament. They're right at the beginning they're all through the Old Testament. They're right there at the beginning of the New Testament, the Archangel Gabriel visiting Mary. And they're right there at the end of the New Testament in the Archangel Michael in the book of Revelation. Now, if that's all just a metaphor or something, then the best you can say is that this is a literary creation which has some moral insight. But as I say, if that's all it is, I'm not interested in it, really. I can get the same from Shakespeare or Dostoevsky or Tolstoy or whatever. And if it's telling me lies, if from start to finish, so the Gospel of John says, and this is written by me, John. The Gospel of Luke says, I investigated everything, spoke to everyone, read all the other accounts, and now I'm giving you my account, the most excellent Theophilus. Now, if those guys were lying to us from the get-go, why would you be interested in anything they say? And I think the experience of ultra-liberal Christianity is that it can't ever sustain itself, because in the end, especially for young people, I mean, it's all right for an aged person like me to look back and say, well, it's all metaphors, but it was socially useful and it would be culturally a tragedy if we lost it. But somebody who's 18, full of that passionate intensity of youth, that willingness to spend their life in a good cause, seeking the truth, they're not going to be interested in something which says, well, as it happens, this is all superstition and none of it is true, but there's a deep moral insight there. I don't think that, first of all, I don't think it's true, but second of all, I don't think that can ever be a winning strategy.
Yeah, well, whether or not it's a winning strategy, I'm not sure. You may well be right there. But let me ask a related question, which is something that you talked a fair bit about, I think, in the first couple of chapters, which is about biblical scholarship. And you're quite critical in this book, or at least in the first part of it, about biblical scholarship broadly, particularly with respect to things like the dating of the Gospels and assigning authorship of the Gospels and the epistles in the New Testament and other issues like that. And I thought that this was sort of interesting to me because as someone who is, an outsider in the sense of a non-Christian and generally sort of skeptical about supernatural or these sorts of claims, it would seem to me that the consensus, or at least the set of positions, the set of views and common findings of the scholarly community who study this and think about it carefully would be at least a very good place to start, and maybe the best that I can get in terms of, what do people think about these texts? So, for example, if I'm reading the Gospels, I can read them, but then I have to assess, kind of like what you were saying about, is this just a nice story, or is there something more to it? And to answer that, I have to assess things like, who wrote this, and why did they write it, and what were their motivations, and what information do they have? And I have to have some of that background, right? And biblical scholarship is at least trying to provide some of that. So I guess my sort of question is, how do you think that particularly non-Christians or people who might be skeptical, how should we go about approaching this aspect of the Gospels in terms of, how do we work out how we should interpret them, or what we should think about their reliability and things like that?
So, James, that's a really interesting issue. It's a really, insightful way that you've put it together. And my answer, I have to apologise, is a little bit complex and cross-grained and nuanced. So I myself am a believing Christian. If the scholars told me that they thought the Gospels were rubbish, I believe the Gospels, I wouldn't believe the scholars. But I'm not asking anybody else to take that view. And I don't think that's the purely rational view, because I think faith goes beyond reason. I don't think faith outrages reason. I think faith is completely consistent with reason, but faith goes beyond reason. In terms of the historicity and so forth of the Gospels, I am not against biblical scholarship at all. In fact, I end up buttressing my case with lots of biblical scholars like Richard Bauckham and N.T. Wright and so forth. But I do think that all scholarship has to have a certain sense of modesty. And a life in journalism has taught me this. 1,000 times people infer facts from the style of a document or the shape of a document or whatever it is. And sometimes their inferences are right and sometimes their inferences are wrong. And very often the inferences seem to be quite obvious. It's plain. Look, he couldn't have written this because it's against that. So I give one example. One of our first prime ministers, Alfred Deakin, our best prime minister, he lost a lot of money in the boom just before Federation, the boom and the bust, the 1890s bust just before Federation. So he had huge debts to pay off. One of the ways he did this was, as Prime Minister, he wrote a newspaper column for a London paper about Australian politics. And he needed more money, so he wrote a second column about Australian politics. And he wrote them both under pen names. Now, if you read those documents, you would say, well, the person who wrote this didn't like Alfred Deakin very much because look how critical this column is. So he would write columns under a pen name criticising himself. Then in the second column, he'd criticise the first column, which criticised himself as Prime Minister. Now, the idea that 2,000 years later, with only a reference to maybe a dozen such columns, you could definitively determine which were written by Alfred Deakin and which were written by someone else is preposterous. That doesn't make scholarship worthless, but it means that there should be a certain provisional quality to it. And the final reflection I'd offer you, although this is a subject we could discuss forever, you mentioned the consensus of scholars ought to be the place to start. There are two things about that. First of all, there is no consensus amongst scholars. The Jesus industry is now so vast that any theory you like, Jesus was a Martian, Jesus was an emanation of the Gaia spirit, Jesus was a politician with no religion, Jesus was a religious rabbi with no politics. You'll find supporters from them in the scholarly community anywhere you like. Secondly, there's a really fundamental epistemological problem. To really approach biblical scholarship with an open mind, you have to be open to the divine. So biblical scholarship, which says there can be no divine intervention in human affairs, has to find explanations for things which rule out the divine, even if that explanation is unlikely or in fact is wrong. But on the other hand, to be open to the divine really means that you kind of believe in the divine. Therefore, you might say that a scholar who is really open to the divine is not broad-minded either. They've really taken their bet. And I think there's some truth in that. You have to make an a priori bet. Am I going to admit the possibility that the gospel is telling the truth about the resurrection and the Son of God and everything else? Or do I believe that that's all untrue? Therefore, I'm going to invent explanations which are consistent with it being untrue. And a lot of skeptical biblical scholarship, I think, has suffered from an inability to have an open mind about the divine. And then the final point I'd make to you is that a lot of things which scholarship previously thought invalidated the New Testament have turned out to be mistaken. So at one point, scholarship thought the Gospels had been written hundreds of years later. Then we find a scrap of John's Gospel, which couldn't be later than the first half of the 2nd century, a physical scrap of the Gospel, I mean. So that means there's an absolute latest date for which the Gospels could be written. So all of the previous scholarship, which thought that it was 200 years later, that's all gone. And then there's the obvious examples. Until this century, people thought there were no synagogues in the Galilee in Jesus' time, that Jews in the Galilee in Jesus' time didn't need to go to the synagogue because didn't need a local synagogue because they went to Jerusalem 3 times a year to visit the temple. Then in 2008, as recently as 2008, the Israeli Antiquities Authority, doing a prospective dig before a hotel was built, discovered the synagogue of Migdal, or Magdalene from the biblical times, which is unmistakably, clearly, irrevocably a synagogue from the Second Temple period, so the period of Jesus. Since then, they've discovered 2 more synagogues. So now you've got clear evidence that there were synagogues in the Galilee in Jesus' time. I'm labouring this point, but some scholars said previously there's no archaeological evidence of synagogues in the Galilee at that time. They came along later, after the Romans destroyed the Second Temple. Then local Jewish communities built synagogues, but not before then. Therefore, in Matthew's Gospel, where it talks about Jesus preaching in the teaching in the synagogues of the Galilee, that proves the Gospel was written later, and the Gospel writer put that in because he didn't realise there were no synagogues back. And then it turns out archaeology discovers the synagogues. So the scholarship, which might have been reasonable, was wrong, and the Gospel was right. So my contention here intellectually is not that I can prove that the Gospels are right, simply that it's reasonable to believe that they're right. But you don't have to believe that on the basis of the evidence. But I do think the evidence now establishes that Jesus was a real person, that he was crucified, and that very soon after his death, the Jesus movement was proclaiming his resurrection. I don't think history can prove the resurrection, nor do I think it disproves the resurrection.
Yeah, obviously there's a lot more that could be discussed there that we don't have time for now. Just one thing that I think is important to think about is that people obviously bring their own preconceptions, their own biases or worldview to the table. And I think that one thing I disagree with is that it's just a question of whether you believe in God or miracles, because there are people like many Jews and Muslims who read these documents and may actually believe that Jesus did miracles, for example, and that God does work in the world, and may believe much of what it says in the New Testament, at least potentially, but don't believe that Jesus was resurrected. And obviously they're bringing their theology to the table about that. But I also think that that's an important aspect of, well, in terms of your specific beliefs about God. But
yes, no, I'd agree with you, James.
I'm not saying you would disagree with that. I just think that's important to mention as well.
Yeah, no, I actually agree with what you've just said. I agree with that. So I was offering a simple binary, but I'm not pretending the simple binary covers all possibilities.
Yeah.
I'm just saying one element of scholarship is, do you believe in the possibility of the divine or not? But of course, even if you accept the possibility of the divine, you might say the Gospels are still all lies. That's an intellectually reasonable position, You might be an Orthodox Hindu who believes that Krishna walked on the earth and so forth, and all of that. So you believe in the divine, you believe in miracles, all the rest of it, but you think the Gospels are not true. That's absolutely perfectly reasonable. So my binary between accepting a possibility of the divine, that's just one. I mean, I agree with you. There are a million other factors, but that's one of the factors that has been important in Western scholarship.
Undoubtedly. And just for clarification, I mean, I don't think that the Gospels are all lies, but I don't think it's all true either. I do think that you can have, I think it's often the case in life, there's sort of room for the middle. But I know you have to be going soon. There's one last question I wanted to ask you, which sort of touches more on the second half of the book. And I guess this is my reaction to a lot of the people that you cover there was fairly positive. I mean, there's a range of people from doing charitable work in Africa to running churches in I think Los Angeles or wherever it was, one of the individuals. And what I appreciate about all these people was that they're sort of living out what they believe is true, right? That they have, different particular denominations, but they all believe in Christians, and that motivates them to act in significant ways that, have a significant impact on their life. And that's something that I've always been a big advocate for, that, people ought to act in accordance with what they believe and sort of bear that out. And in my this part is purely from my experience. I'm not saying you have to share it. From my experience, a lot of the people that I've spoken to, a lot of the people that I know who are Christians, and like, real church going Christians, not people who just say that they are Christians. I still often find that they're just a lot like other people. I mean, I'm not saying that I expect Christians to not be people, you understand, but in terms of just, people are often just kind of lazy and self-interested and like kind of say one thing and do another thing. And I just don't always find that Christians are that different to the rest of us. And I sometimes feel like, well, look, if you're sort of born again in Christ, or if you're led by the Spirit and these sorts of things, maybe we expect a little bit more. And there are Christians who have borne that out across history, and I think you document some of them. But I guess sort of my question is sort of, what do you think about that sort of side of things? How would you, what's your view about how Christians should live out their view, or how we should be able to sort of see what Christianity, or what effect it has for people in their lives?
Well, James, that's another huge question, and I don't dispute your insight at all. Just also a footnote. I mean, it is also possible to believe that there are things in the gospel which are true, but the miracles are not true. So that's a reasonable point of view. I'm not saying that's unreasonable. It's not my point of view, but it's a perfectly. So I'm not suggesting the other points of view are unreasonable. I'm just suggesting that the point of an Orthodox believer is also reasonable. It's reasonable. I'm not putting it higher than that. But look, the point you make about the gap between Christian teaching and Christian lives, I got to plead guilty. Dear God, you don't have to look very far. Just talk to the person you're interviewing. Hands up, absolutely, 100%. And, one of the things that made me reluctant to write these two books was the shocking gap between what I believe and the rackety journalistic dissolute life that I've led. And that's a real problem for Christians. But here's the thing. Being a Christian does not absolve you of the human condition. You remain caught up in the contradictions of your own humanity. And you remain, with Solzhenitsyn, who remarked, the line between good and evil does not run between a group of good people over here and a group of evil people over there. It runs down the middle of every human heart, and every human heart is at war with itself every day between the good and the evil that it is inclined to do. When Christians really behave badly, that's not only wicked, but it's scandalous, in the use of the old term. It's scandalous. Your reflection is a perfectly accurate, reasonable, just reflection, and it is a scandal that Christians are not more different. One of the people I interview in the book is a woman named Jenny George, and she's sort of been involved with a mental health charity. She's a wonderful Anglican woman in Melbourne, and she says, if Christianity doesn't make her different from the culture around her, then she feels that she is failing. By different, she means giving a large proportion of her income to charity, spending a large proportion of her time helping people who need help. Now, there are people absolutely impelled by this, as you say. I interview a woman from the Salvation Army, and having spent a lot of time in pubs as a young journalist, I know the salvos were always there for the alkies. If nobody else would deal with you, if you're the most difficult person in the world, the salvos were there for you. So the love of Christ propelled them to that. But how do you explain then the complacent, the slothful, the lazy, the selfish, the malicious, the wretched Christians? One reflection I'd offer without being too twee about it, a friend of Evelyn Waugh's said this to him once. She said, Evelyn, you claim to be a Christian, and you are one of the most malicious and disagreeable people I've ever met. How can this be? To which he responded, he didn't dispute her assessment at all. He just said, if I were not a Christian, you would scarcely recognize me as a human being. And he struggled all his life to be better than he was. I have a great friend in England whom I write about in this book, Piers Paul Reid, a great English novelist, who wrote a biography of Alec Guinness. Alec Guinness was also a believing Christian, the great actor. And Piers observes that Alec Guinness was an extremely nasty man who struggled all his life to be a kind man. Now, he didn't always win that struggle. In fact, he very often lost that struggle. But there was a heroism in that struggle. He understood his own failings and he struggled against them. Now, you wish that he'd done a bit better, but there was some heroism in the struggle. And of course, the final reflection I'd offer you, James, is that I don't feel as a Christian that I know anything at all about anyone else's life. So God is a mysterious, God's told us a lot about himself through the revelation of the Jewish people and in the New Testament and so on. And I believe it's a Christian view that non-Christian religions also embody people responding to the reality of God. But God can find his way into human hearts in mysterious ways, and people respond to that in mysterious ways. They don't have to, conform to any formula that I give them about belief or anything like that. And, I agree with you. You ought to find more conspicuous, heroic goodness in Christians than you do. But there's quite a lot of it there as well. But there's a lot of it in humanity more broadly. And, I'd celebrate God's goodness in humanity, both within the Christian church and beyond the Christian church.
Yeah, that's a very interesting reflection. That's one of the questions that I have thought a lot about I don't know, the last few years, and like to ask my Christian friends about, because honestly, it's one of the biggest concerns that I have in terms of when I think about what sort of life would I like to lead? Would I want to commit myself to Christianity or a different religious tradition? And the question is, like, is it true? Is obviously important to that. But a component of being true is sort of making a difference in people's lives. If it was just all sort of abstractly true, but kind of didn't, it didn't actually do anything, then, well, first of all, that wouldn't really make sense, but also it would kind of be pointless. I mean, I can't remember what you said. You'd rather be at I forget where it was exactly, at the
races,
barbecue. Yeah, the races. That's right. Yeah, not exactly how I'd put it, but a similar sort of idea. So I don't know, that aspect of it is important to me. And so, yeah, it's something that I'm continuing to think about, because it is a bit hard to sort of know, well, on the one hand, it's hard to judge other people and what would you expect to see. And, God works in different ways. But there's still part of me that thinks, if Christianity were really true and people had relation with God in the way that they say they do, I just would expect it to look different. I'm not asking you to agree with that here. That's just sort of, one of the reflections that I've had.
Could I offer you, I know we need to wind up, but could I offer you two very brief further reflections on that?
Yeah, sure. Feel free.
One is, I've been tremendously influenced by the writings of Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. He died a year or two ago, the former chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, and wonderful writings about God and science and all of that. But he makes the point that the words for God in Hebrew, they're active words. God is a verb. It's not a noun,
Yeah, you mentioned that.
This is kind of bearing out your insight, really. And of course, I think the intellectual side of Christianity is just one side of it, and it's not the most important side. And the other reflection I'd offer you is Roger Scruton's lovely book, The Soul of the World. He makes the point that the overwhelming evidence for God is not a rational deduction. Very, very few people, I think, come to God through rational processes. The overwhelming evidence for God is the experience of God. And predominantly, people find that through other people. So, if you're an impoverished person living on the streets of Calcutta and one of Mother Teresa's nuns ministers to you, you might very well find the reality of God in that nun. And that's vastly more important. So my business of writing books, arguing the toss and so on, and saying, look, it's not unreasonable to believe in Christ. I believe that has a worth, but that's really a sideshow to people living their lives in the light of their friendship with Christ.
Yeah, I mean, I'm, as you probably know, very engaged and interested in the intellectual side of things as well, not just with respect to Christianity, but more generally. But yeah, there is a part of me that often is concerned about how detached that is from most people's actual experience. And part of me thinks, well, people should be, insofar as they are able, a bit more engaged with the intellectual side of things, especially in the West when we do have access to information. But then at the same time,
I agree with that.
Not everyone's, people have different, anyway. So that's a complicated question to talk about there. Anyway, So are there any last comments that you wanted to make, or?
Well, the last thing I'd
following
say,
us?
partly, so first of all, I've really enjoyed this discussion. It's so interesting, and thank you very much for doing it. And
No worries. Thanks for coming
who
along.
knows, maybe some months down the track we might do another on some specific matter. But I've really enjoyed it tremendously. The other thing is just this final question. This one, it's a very important point you make about how people live their lives. I certainly also believe in the intellectual vocation, but I think it's much more important, to live decently than to write well. But
Yeah.
having lived decently, you should also write well. That's
Yeah.
and one reason I write these books is because I think people are not engaging enough intellectually. But the performance of Christians ought to be better. I agree with that. But bear in mind that the biggest deliverer of charitable services in Australia after the federal government is the Catholic Church, and the next biggest deliverer of social services after them is the Anglican Church. And the you'll find many hospitals in India founded by Christian organisations. You find very few founded by the Fabian Society. That's a cheap shot. I'm not really having a shot at the Fabian Society. But every parish I've ever been involved in any Christian encounter of any kind in Australia, has its very active, so the local Catholic parish I go to is a very big St Vincent de Paul society. It really works hard to look after the poor people in the parish and more broadly. I've got great friends who are Anglicans in the same district. Their church is constantly raising money for overseas charities. In America, I think the evangelicals have taken a terrible turn in getting too involved with Trump. It's a terrible thing. But the biggest givers to charity are evangelical Christians. I feel strange saying these things, so I'm not trying to skite about Christianity, but I just would say, even when a life looks very ordinary and people don't seem to be possessed of much charism, they can be doing good works, quietly. And I wouldn't, dismiss that element of Christianity, even in a comfortable middle-class society like Australia.
Yeah, well, that's a fair observation. I'm involved in a movement called effective altruism, which is mostly comprised of atheists, but not exclusively. And one of the things we focus on a lot is in giving and giving potentially a lot, and thinking about also the effectiveness of where we give. And maybe we could even talk about more about that sort of sometime if we have time. But I guess the point is I really agree with the point that you're making about how sort of the good works and the manifesting of that in a social context is extremely important. And I often despair a bit about how well, could go on for a lot about that, how contemporary Western society has kind of lost sight of that to a significant extent. I don't know if we'd ever had sight of it, but a lot of people just sort of focus on their own gratification a lot of the time. But thankfully, as you partly document in the book, and as we see elsewhere as well, there are important exceptions to that. If that's all the time we have, then I'd like to thank you very much for joining me and for discussing your book. And it was a pleasure.
Thanks very much, James. Really great to meet you. And will you send me a link or something to the
Yeah, I'll shoot you an email to this.
Thanks, great. Thanks very much, James. Really great to talk, and I hope we
No
get the
worries.
chance to do it again. All the
Yeah,
best.
it'd be nice. Thanks very much. Bye.
Sure. Bye-bye.
All right. So that concludes that. It's a shame we didn't have a bit more time for the interview, but you make do with what you have. So I might just spend a few minutes responding a bit to chat. I knew that we wouldn't really get to look at chat during the interview part because we didn't have very much time. So the book itself, I think we gave a reasonably good overview of the sort of stuff's there. As I think I said, maybe I didn't say this. I think the second part was more interesting to me than the first part. The points about biblical scholarship, as I sort of indicated, I didn't really agree with. But maybe that's something we could discuss further another time. But let me just have a look at a few of the comments here to see if there's anything that I wanted to respond to here. Trevor says that as a longtime reader of Greg Sheridan's newspaper journalism, he would compliment that he never found a sense of religious views influencing the reporting. So yeah, I don't really read much journalism, to be honest. So I can't validate that, although it does seem consistent with what I've read elsewhere. It was good to have the opportunity to chat with him and just sort of see his perspective on things. Let's see. Can't see much. Oh, hang on. What's this? He's drawing the inference that God did it because it says so in a book, also within the confines of modesty as described. Not sure that's in line with goods on offer here. Goods on offer here. Oh, yeah. Well, so this is sort of what I wanted to draw out a little bit. That what you get out of the Gospels and like Paul's epistles and so forth in the New Testament, I think really does depend on what you come to them with. So for someone who is really hostile to sort of anything that they're going to say, then they're probably not going to get that much out of them. For someone who's open to what they may say, but are not really likely to believe in the miraculous or supernatural claims, and that's maybe where I would put myself, then, you might get a fair bit out of it, but still not ultimately accept that there's anything to be said sort of supernaturally, or that there's anything that needs explaining. And then there are, there's various Christian denominations who say different things. I think one thing I'm not convinced that that Greg was entirely fair with respect to liberal Christians. I'm not really in a position to defend that well, because I don't. Well, I'm pretty sure that they don't think that the Gospels are full of lies, or the Bible more generally is full of lies. I think that they just understand what it is and what it claims to be and what its point is differently. At least that's my impression. And sort of that's part of what I was getting at with the question about scholars, right? Because if I read Revelation, right, the book of Revelation, and I read about these different beasts with like all of these eyes and this bizarre apocalyptic imagery, right? I can read that, but the question is, what am I going to get out of that? What does it mean? Like, what is it trying to tell me? And for most people, they're not going to have the faintest idea unless they have some background to help interpret that. Is it just an episode of Doctor Who or Star Trek, or is this supposed to be like a literal prediction about the future, or is this trying to convey some spiritual truth that really is kind of distinct separate from the image? I mean, that's the way that it's typically interpreted, right? It's apocalyptic imagery. It's not literal, but that's sort of the point, right? You have to know the genre of the book that you're looking at. You have to know who the author was, or at least some idea about the type of person they were and their intentions. And as a layperson just picking up the book, I don't think you can get that. You have to sort of go beyond the text to sort of access that, right? So Revelation might be an extreme case there, because I chose that because it is an apocalyptic book. It's not like a historical work of describing events in the past, but then when I read the Gospels and it says that Jesus said this, and then I get a quote, well, how do I understand that quote? Am I to understand that as someone memorized the exact words that Jesus said and then translated them into Greek? Because the Gospel was written in Greek, but Jesus spoke Aramaic, right? Because if that's how I should understand it, then I'm going to have one attitude. Or is this more of a paraphrase of what he said? Or is this not even really a paraphrase? It's more like an illustrative example of the sort of thing that he said, but he may never have said that specific thing, or even in a paraphrase, right? If you sort of could take a time machine back to wherever the exact time and place where he supposedly said that, maybe he wasn't actually there, right? Because this is more of a telescoping, a truncation, a combination of events, like they do when they adapt books to movies, right? That they combine characters and they combine events and they change things, maybe preserving the gist and the overall flow, right? But not necessarily precise incidents. So when I'm looking at the resurrection appearances, should I interpret each one specifically records an appearance as it occurred, in detail, or should I interpret that more as this is the kind of thing that was experienced, but the precise it's more illustrative than exact. Now, I'm not making a claim about how you should. All I'm saying is that your answer to that depends on how you're going to interpret the genre and the interpretive framework, and who the author was and what their intentions were and what they regarded as acceptable practice. What counts as a lie, or what counts as a reasonable extrapolation, what counts as an illustration for the sake of argument, things like that, right? And the point is, you can't just get that from reading the text. You have to go sort of beyond the text and do sort of interpretive work. I don't really think Greg would disagree with that. It's just, I think that it's easy to be very critical of those who have different interpretive positions than we do. And I find that, I mean, this is a criticism that I would raise, that Christians who say, look, first chapter of Genesis is clearly, not like literal history. And Revelation's clearly not like a literal description of what's going to happen. But everything in the Gospels is literal. That's not that's a fairly common view. I'm not even saying it's an unreasonable view. All I'm saying is that for everyone like that, you'll find Christians who say, no, first Genesis, like that's literal history as well. And then there are others who say, no, like the Gospels, they're also like they're historical, but they're not like everything in them is exactly what it was like historically. You have to understand the interpretation and the practice and the purpose of the authors and historical conventions and blah, blah, blah. So like you're going to see people all across the spectrum about what the purpose and the genre and all of that was of the authors. And so when you do that, it's not a question anymore about like, is it true or false or is it a lie? Or it's like, well, what was it trying to say? In so much as it was trying to, as the book or the author was trying to convey a particular point, and in so much as they thought that they were trying to convey something that they believe was accurate, then you sort of have to assess it against that. So, when Jesus told a story about when Jesus talked in parables, for example, were those lies? Well, I don't think so, right? They were not supposed to be. When Jesus said, there was a what's an example? The prodigal son, right? When he says that there was a father who had two sons, like, well, was he lying? Well, no, he wasn't lying, right? He was telling the truth, but it was doing it through a parable. So when a gospel writer says that Jesus said this at this location, are they lying? Well, Jesus clearly didn't say that because he didn't speak Greek, and even then he probably didn't, because they didn't transcribe things. This is the point I'm making, right? It's all about how you interpret it and exactly how far you want to go from sort of literal to figurative or to whatever purpose is going to be conveyed. So again, I'm not taking a position on that. All I'm saying is that I think you need some of that nuance in looking at how different people look at things, and that's why I try to ask people when they're when you converse with them about what they think the books are claiming and what they're trying to do. Anyway, so that was just a little bit of reflection on that. Let's see. I'm trying to think if there was anything else that I wanted to briefly mention that we sort of didn't have time to talk about. So we talked about the biblical scholarship stuff. We talked about the examples of Christians, acting their faith and so forth. The one other stream of the book that I sort of made a few notes on was the idea of the importance of Christianity to Western civilization. This is a point that Greg mentions. He doesn't really belabor it too much because I think that this point can be. I mean, I agree with it, but I think it can also be overstated a little bit. Just like because Western civilization was around for a good 1,000 years before Christianity came along. So I think that some people, I'm not saying Greg is doing this, but some people I think overstate they sort of almost equate Christianity or Judeo-Christian views or ethics or philosophy with Western civilization. I think that's kind of a mistake. I think that Western civilization has many threads to it. Christian philosophy and ethics and so forth, and art and all that. That's a very important thread or set of threads, I guess, but it's not the only one. And there are also those who claim that the Christianity leads to everything else, like it leads to the Enlightenment and it leads to the democratization, things like that. And I think that that's an overreach. But again, that's a sort of another point. But anyway, so Greg sort of mentions this a few times, and I would have liked to ask him a little bit more about what his sort of broader views are there, because he sort of indicates that he thinks. Well, there's a few passages from the book where he kind of implies that he thinks that Western civilization as a whole is on a downward trajectory or is in a really bad situation because of people moving away from Christianity. And I'm not really convinced about that. I should say, I don't think that it's necessarily good that people leave Christianity, because I think it all depends on what they replace it with. It could be better, but it could be worse, depending on what sort of viewpoints. Like if they, I think certain forms of extreme versions of Christianity can be quite harmful. Many moderate forms I don't think are on balance harmful, although there are certain practices or beliefs that they propagate that I think are bad or wrong. But if you go from being a moderate Christian to being a radical Marxist or something like that, or a right wing reactionary, that's really hard to say, or an Islamic extremist, well, that's clearly, I would say, that's clearly bad. So it's not the fact that people are becoming less religious in and of itself, I don't think is either good or bad. It sort of depends on how things are going, or what people are replacing it with. And I think that there is a concern. Well, I have a concern that Western culture does seem to be quite materialistic. or consumeristic. I'm not exactly sure what the right word is. And maybe it was always like that, but I think that there is a need to focus more on. See, some would say the transcendent. So I don't think that there's anything transcendent, right? But transcendent in terms of transcending yourself or your immediate like surroundings, thinking about the bigger picture, thinking about others, like philosophy, ethics, doing good for mankind, bettering yourself, that sort of thing. I don't know that the sort of the messages that we seem to hear a lot in popular culture would be one about tolerance, which I think is good in general. But tolerance can go too far if you tolerate literally anything. And another one would be just kind of self-actualization, just sort of be yourself. You'll find the way you are, which is good to an extent. But then I think it sort of misses the point about self-improvement, right? Like, you're not perfect the way you are, because we could be better. We should be striving to be better and to make our society better as well. So anyway, so I sort of see that there's a point there, but I'm not convinced that it's entirely related to the decline of Christianity, because I think that you can have a lot of negative aspects like that within Christianity as well. We sort of talked a little bit about that. Anyway, so there's just a few additional reflections on some other points of it. I don't think that there's much of anything else that I wanted to draw out from chat. So thanks, everyone, for tuning in. In terms of what's going to be happening coming up soon. Oh, actually, there is one little thing, a little nugget for you. Hang on, now I have to find it. Whet your appetite for future content. Actually, so there's a couple of things coming up. I'm going to be talking on Rebecca's channel, Bread of Life, I think it is, about my sort of religious journey. And that's going to be happening this weekend, my time. So obviously, I don't know when that is your time, because I don't know where you are, but sort of stay tuned for that. But so there's something else that I just noticed, actually, and now I'm trying to find it. Some of you may have noticed that I've been posting up a lot of debates from other channels recently. And that's in response to people indicating that they would like to see more of they like to see reposts of some of the things that I've been involved in on other channels, because that would be useful for them. So that's what all that has been about. So hopefully you have been enjoying those. So I'm just trying to find this post that I saw, which I thought was interesting. Yeah, so if people have suggestions about content that they would like me to cover, like particularly response videos, which or responding to written written text as well, is there a non-written sort of text, then I'm also open to that. We've done book reviews and things before. I guess this was a book review. Yeah, so please send those my way. I did a poll recently. We're asking people if they'd be interested in a bit more sort of socio-political content, and I think there was general interest in that. So I will be keeping an eye out on things that topics or people, videos, and so forth that hit my attention, strike my attention. It doesn't feel right. Catch my attention. I guess that's the right term. Yeah. So particularly, maybe just a little bit of context there. I'm really worried about the state of political discourse and how hyperpolarized it is, because although the religious debates and like atheism and Christianity and all that can be kind of toxic sometimes, I kind of feel like the state of political discourse is even worse a lot of the time. And I guess that's hard to quantify, but I'd like to bring, like, I don't think I have the answers to a lot of this stuff, but I think that I can bring a little bit of clarity sometimes, a bit of maybe philosophical perspective or perspective from some of my own readings and studies. So just because there's so much nonsense out there, and both from the left and on the right. And I'm pretty centrist myself, to be honest. So I often find myself reacting negatively to right-wing and left-wing stuff, just because a lot of it's pretty slogany and pretty appealing to emotions and catchphrases that kind of sound good but don't make a lot of sense when you think about it, or just gross simplifications of history and things like that, or misstatements of fact in various ways, or sloppy causal inference, things like this that I just generally don't like. So some of that stuff I'd kind of like to be covering a little bit more. Anyway, one last thing. So I finally found a link here. I literally just saw this before I started streaming, so I thought, ooh, this looks exciting. So Where are we here? So here we go. So this is on. Is this working? What? No, that's not what I wanted to share. That's my calendar. Oh dear. Hang on. Let's fix that. There we go. Sorry about that. I shared the wrong tab. Yeah, so this is from Trinity Radio. Just put this up. So Braxton here intended to drop a really long video essay responding to my, James Furtell's, reaction to my recent presentation on consciousness. But time got away from me, and hang on. But in the 1.5 response I've already recorded, I make reference to one of my favorite short form channels. Not quite sure what he means by that. I guess he's going to post it up soon. That photo of me is really terrible. I don't know where. I feel like it's degraded in quality somehow, but anyway, whatever. So anyway, the point is, it looks like that Braxton's going to release a response to the video that I did recently about him, his sermon about consciousness. So that'll be exciting. I'll definitely be on the lookout for that, and hopefully there'll be some interesting things to respond to. Braxton also has a video that he did months ago that was responding to me that I haven't done a response to, partly because I didn't feel that was that much to respond to, but I may slot a few of those things there as well. So so that is that's definitely something to look forward to. By the way, this comment here that I can't help noticing down here, I swear I've read this exact comment somewhere before. Like, I don't know who this person is, but it's just when I read it, I'm like, I swear I've read these exact words somewhere, but they've only posted this 2 hours ago. So James Furtell is a smart guy, and I really think that he's one of the most interesting atheists on the internet. However, his biggest mistake is to underestimate theistic philosophers and call them dishonest, manipulative, or ignorant just because they reach different conclusions than me. So I do sometimes criticize theistic philosophers for being manipulative or dishonest. Not sure I've criticized them for being ignorant. Perhaps I have before, maybe about science or something. But I guess the point I would make about this critique here is that if I criticize someone for being, say, manipulative or dishonest, I don't know that you can say that that's a mistake unless I'm wrong about it, right? So if I say someone's manipulative or dishonest, and I give some substantiation for that, which I like to think that I do if I make the claim, then that's not a mistake, right? It's a mistake if you then can show, well, actually, they weren't being manipulative or dishonest, or that the evidence that I've cited is not good, right? Is not a good reason to think that they were being manipulative or dishonest. So I don't think that we should, in public discourse, I don't think that we should focus on other people's character. I think we should focus on their arguments. But I don't think that we should feel that we can never talk about whether we think that someone is being dishonest or manipulative or ignorant in the sense of missing key points. So I think that I don't think there's a problem with talking about that stuff, as long as you don't just sort of throw it out there. If we think it's relevant, and then we say, look, I think this is manipulative because X, Y, and Z, or I think that this is dishonest and misrepresenting something because A, B, C. I don't see what the problem is there. And so if someone thinks that I'm wrong about that, then fine. Then I might be wrong, and then they can show me where I've gone wrong. But I guess the point is, I don't think it's a mistake just to make the claim. Like it's a mistake if the claim is mistaken, not just because you make the claim. Like, this assumption here is that the claim can never be correct. I don't think that I do underestimate theistic philosophers. Actually, one of my points that I've been making for years is that most atheists underestimate theistic philosophers and apologetics generally, and we need to take it way more seriously. Anyway, so a couple of points there. So John Smith says that is the first picture that shows it when you Google your name. Probably why I used it. Yeah, that's fair. I'm actually trying to sort of change that, because increasingly people are using pictures of me. I don't know. This sounds kind of conceited, but in response videos, people use pictures of me, and I kind of would like them to be better. So, I don't mind people using a picture of me, but some of them I've seen use are not that I think pictures of me are generally that great, but maybe I'll have to try to upload some better ones. Anyway, yeah, so thanks everyone for your time. So look forward to, oh, sorry. Keep forgetting that I've shared that. That was just a random thing that I saw. Thanks everyone for watching. Thanks for your time. Hopefully you found this interesting. I'd sort of like to have more kind of just sort of interview discussions like this. I think that that's helpful as well, just to kind of break down barriers and hear what other people have to say. Yeah, so be on the lookout for that upcoming content of the various forms that I mentioned. Take care of yourselves. Talk to you next time.